Wow. It's so good to see such a full auditorium here at ETH Zurich. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this year's Karl Brunner lecture organized by the Swiss National Bank. And hello, everyone joining us live via the stream. My name is Tanja König, and it's my great pleasure to guide you throughout today's event. Now, tonight, we will hear from one of the leading researchers in the field of international macroeconomics, who also held high-level advisory positions. She will paint us a picture about the art of monetary policy. But how does this relate to ETH Zurich? Well, let's ask the president himself of ETH Zurich. Please welcome Joël Mesot.
Thank you, Tanja. Dear Martin, esteemed Professor Forbes, dear ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to ETH Zurich. You have given me a very difficult task. So this is already the 8th edition of the Karl Brunner Distinguished Lecture of the Swiss National Bank. It has become a great tradition for us to host this event and benefit from amazing economic thinkers who otherwise may not have come to our university. I must say tonight's lecture with the catchy title, The Art of Monetary Policy, is something I look particularly forward to. Now I'm trying to fulfill the task that I was asked to address. It is fascinating to explore the multi-layered connections between science and art. While the two words are different in some respects, there is also a lot they share, and often they complement each other. Just last week, we had a retreat with our faculties, and there were music and science, and we had quite interesting debates about the connections and the difference of the two words. What the two worlds, science and art, have in common is that they can only thrive on the foundation of a free society. I'm also thinking of art and science as two examples that not only push the boundaries, but often challenge the status quo. We are currently hosting an art installation here at ETH, Zurich's main building, that is directly inspired by scientific research. If you would like, you can make a short stop on the Polyterrasse at the end of this event, and you will see a scrolling text at the top of the building facade. With this installation, Breathe, artist Khalil Béraud evokes the path that the air has traveled through the atmosphere over the past 30 days before it arrived at ETH Zurich. Air parcels can be backtracked via so-called trajectories, and the data used by the Swiss-Lebanese artist is based on calculations from the atmospheric dynamics group at ETH Zurich. Breathe is a fine example of how art can create awareness and how scientific data can suddenly become thought-provoking information. A lot of our engineering research is well suited for interaction with artistic forms of expression, and I would like to mention just one example from our computer science department, which takes place at the interface between art and entertainment. As part of a collaboration with ETH Zurich, the Walt Disney Company has used the expertise of our visual computing specialists for many Hollywood films, whether Frozen, The Lion King, Star Wars. All these movies contain technology that was developed here in Zurich. And by the way, there are a number of startups that have emerged from this. By the way, the Disney Lab at ETH Zurich is the only research lab of Walt Disney outside of the US. And the researchers involved have been awarded 2 tech Oscars. So to Americans, it's important for their groundbreaking visual tools to improve virtual characters. On another level, one can also refer to great architects and civil engineers. I call our architects the artists of ETH, who have realized landmark buildings in Switzerland, but also exported around the world, from Ottmar Amann's George Washington Bridge and the Elbe Philharmonic Hall in Hamburg by Herzog de Meuron, to the filigree bridge structures by Santiago Calatrava. All these creative minds are alumni of this university, and even some were professors here. No doubt, the rapid pace of technological development is expanding the spectrum of artistic forms of expression. However, what AI can already do today, and we probably be able to do tomorrow, also raises a lot of questions to which we need to find answers. I'm thinking in the ethical field. It is therefore important for us to teach students critical thinking during their time at ETH, so that they can also reflect on the problematic aspects of technology. In this sense, art is an excellent vector for fostering the public debate and dialogue about both the opportunities and risks of scientific progress. Now I will leave my thoughts here and happily pass the floor back to Tanya. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Joël, Mesot, also for having us here. And with this, I'd like to hand over to tonight's host of the event, Martin Schlegel. He just took over as the chairman of the governing board of the SNB at the beginning of this month. So it's only his third day at the helm of the Swiss National Bank. So please give a warm welcome to Martin Schlegel.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the 8th Karl Brunner Distinguished Lecture. We are delighted and honored that Professor Kristin Forbes accepted our invitation to Zurich, so thank you very much. But first, I would also like to thank Joël Mesot, the president of the ETH Zurich, for their hospitality and that we can be here. So it's always good to be at ETH Zurich. When we began our search for tonight's speaker, we had specific qualities in mind. We were looking for an exceptional economist who is at home both in academia but also in policy, and who can communicate things very clearly. With these qualities in mind, one name quickly came up. It was Kristin Forbes. Not only is she a distinguished economist, but she has also rotated between academia and policy work throughout her career. Her work combines both areas. She uses research to inform policy, and she uses policy to guide her research. Kristin Forbes is a professor of management and global economics at MIT Sloan School of Management, but she is also a prolific writer. So far, she had published more than 150 articles, and that's really a very large number. And her output continues to grow. So her research covers a broad range of topics, from international economics to financial contagion, capital flows, monetary policy, and financial stability. Kristin's work is known for its rigor, its clarity, and also its relevance. In an early article published in the American Economic Review in 2000, she examined the relationship between economic income inequality and growth. This topic has since received widespread attention within academia and beyond. This paper illustrates Kristin's exceptional ability to identify critical issues. Her research helps to clarify our understanding of when and why crises spread. More recently, Kristin's research has addressed questions of direct importance for central banks. For example, she has studied the behavior of interest rate cycles across country and also over time. She has also provided policy insights on how to tackle inflation more effectively. Kristin is known for her exceptional clarity of her work, a quality which is appreciated not least by her students. So she has received many teaching awards, and one of her classes is among the most popular at MIT. But her impact extends far more beyond academia. For instance, she also writes articles in the Financial Times and other newspapers. These articles demonstrate Kristin's talent for making complex economic concepts accessible to a wide audience. Her articles are not only informative, but also a pleasure to read. Ladies and gentlemen, you can clearly see that Kristin's commitment to international economics is really very big, so committed that she even chose to get married at Bretton Woods, which is the birthplace of the IMF and the World Bank. But where does this passion for economics come from? When she began her studies in 1988, Kristin explored a variety of topics, from astrophysics to religion and also to psychology. However, it was Morton Shapiro's application of economic principles to everyday life that really caught her attention. The practical application of economic insights has remained central to Kristin's work ever since. So she has built a long and very successful career in academia. But she also possesses a vast experience in policy work, both in Europe, but also in the United States. So let me share another little anecdote. In 2001, after returning from a run, she discovered a message on her answering machine. At the time, this was still a machine. And the message was from no other than John Taylor. This is the inventor of the famous Taylor rule for setting interest rates for central banks. She was so surprised by this call that she initially thought it was a joke or a mistake, but of course it was not. John Taylor was inviting her to establish a division at the US Treasury Department. But as an aspiring professor, her priority was to publish in leading journals, and so she declined the offer. Not only once, but actually twice. It was then the late Rudi Dornbusch who eventually convinced her to change her mind and join the US Treasury. Later, when she went back to MIT, Kristin focused her research on the issues she had encountered at the Treasury. And then the phone rang again. This time, it was an invitation from Gregory Mankiw to join the US President's Council of Economic Advisors. At 33, she was the youngest person ever to serve on this council. Kristin has continued to serve on many committees ever since. So from 2014 to 2017, she was an external member of the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England. And currently, she serves on advisory boards of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the International Monetary Fund, and also the Bank for International Settlements. She is also the convener of the Bellagio Group. This is a gathering of top academics and officials who meet annually to discuss issues regarding economics and financial issues. It was actually at the Bellagio meeting in Stockholm that I had the pleasure to meet Kristin for the first time. Kristin, we are very honored that you accepted the invitation to speak to us tonight and come to Zurich. So we are all greatly look forward to your speech. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kristin Forbes with a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that incredibly generous and long introduction. I will admit I always had respect for the research department at the Swiss National Bank, and wow, they did the research on that one. I'm not sure how you found out where I got married and things like that. But anyway, I am impressed. So it is really a pleasure to be here today. Thank you to the Swiss National Bank and to ETH Zurich for inviting me. It really is an honor. And it's just a pleasure to be back in this fantastic city. It's great to be in a classroom, too. My passion really is teaching. It's fantastic to be here to honor Karl Brunner and to think about lessons from monetary policy based on the unprecedented experiences we have had over the last 2 decades. So to do this tonight, I'm going to draw on the principles from Sun Tzu. And he's a Chinese philosopher who I assume many of you studied at some point in your careers, a philosopher and military strategist who drafted The Art of War in the 5th century BC. And so let me be clear, I am not here to talk about military strategies or war. There are enough horrific events in the world right now that is way beyond my pay grade. I'm going to stick to something much simpler, which is monetary policy. But with that, let me just give you a taste of the sorts of analogies I will bring to bear tonight. So here is from the very first chapter, the very beginning of Sun Tzu's famous book, The Art of War. And substitute monetary policy instead of war in this. So the art of monetary policy is vital importance to the state. And I will discuss at length in my comments of how the world has had to battle against the global financial crisis in 2008, a COVID pandemic in 2020, and the policy responses that central banks took played a critical role in stabilizing financial systems and supporting incomes, such that their decisions were in many ways a matter of life and death, of helping to find the road to either safety or ruin. As I was also discussed, a key theme of my comments tonight will be that in order to find this path to safety, central banks have had to innovate and develop a multifaceted new set of weapons that have substantially expanded their powers and their reach. And in many countries, these responses have been complicated, contentious, and as costly as military battles. So there has, justifiably so, raised many questions about the effectiveness and utilization of these new tools and the increased powers of central banks, such that an inquiry can on no count be neglected to understand the past as well as to plan for the future, as central banks will inevitably be called into service during the next economic and financial conflagration. And unfortunately, there will be more. So the goal, again, of my comments tonight is to carry out this inquiry, drawing lessons from the last 2 decades and then using those insights to provide suggestions for how central banks can improve their responses and support more resilient and stronger economies in the future. So to do that, I'm going to draw on 6 of the key principles from Sun Tzu's work, and I will go through them quickly, and then I will spend the rest of the time building them up with more detail and more concrete examples. So the first lesson, based on the first principle from Sun Tzu, is the importance of laying plans well in advance in order to prepare for the next battle. The interconnection of global markets, combined with financial innovation, allows shocks to propagate much more quickly and violently than in the past. Policymakers now have little time to craft a response when a crisis hits, so detailed contingency planning must be done well in advance. Second lesson is the acceptance of the power and inevitability of what Sun Tzu calls heaven, i.e. external shocks. The role of external shocks has grown over time, can have first-order effects on financial markets and broader economies, and central banks need to adjust their strategies and their mandates and their goals to just accept and adapt that there are powerful forces outside their control, and they have to just live and function in that world. The third lesson I will talk about is the importance of working within the constraints of what Sun Tzu calls earth and terrain. Basically, work within your boundaries in the given environment you start in order to maneuver effectively in the face of each challenge. The appropriate combination of method, and with careful planning, such as establishing strong macroprudential defenses, economies can build a more resilient starting point and therefore be better prepared for the large heavenly external shocks. Fourth lesson, will be in the importance of combining different tools and methods in order to maneuver effectively in the face of every challenge. The appropriate combination of methods will vary based on each situation, and we have learned some very important lessons for central banks over the last 2 decades if they've experimented with new tools and new ways of combining tools. And we've learned what works and also some that don't work or combine well together. And then the final lesson I will talk about is the importance of accounting for resources and costs of different strategies in order to fully assess the trade-offs of every decision. Many central banks over the last 2 decades adopted policies that were sometimes seen as a free lunch, or there was a do-whatever-it-takes approach without a careful thought of the costs that came ex post. And now, as we are in a period of relative calm, it is time to take a step back and think what could have done better to improve the trade-offs and reduce the costs. So my conclusions after going through all of this will echo those of Sun Tzu's. The combination of decisions which lead to success in war, as well as to monetary policy, is more of an art than a science. There is no single action, no single tactic, no single equation that can guarantee victory. But if you follow a set of guiding principles, which I'll outline today, that can increase the odds of success and reduce the odds of the worst outcomes. So even though the strategies by central banks over the last 2 decades have been much more activist, and they were far from perfect, as I will talk about, and they didn't always meet these 6 principles, the flexibility and willingness to innovate with new battle maneuvers did play a critical role in helping stabilize financial systems and supporting broader economic recoveries. So just to highlight just how unprecedented the last 2 decades has been, here's a graph of median income per capita from 1900 to 2022 for a broad sample of diverse economies of all different income levels, basically every country that has data from the beginning through the end. And what you see is that the early 1900s, the first half of the century, was volatile. When you have 2 major world wars and a Great Depression, incomes are hit hard, and there's a lot of volatility, very difficult period. But then fast forward to the last 2 decades, you see the collapse in incomes around the 2 most recent battles, the 2008 global financial crisis and the 2020 pandemic. The collapse in incomes was unlike anything we have experienced in the world since the first half of the 1900s. And in fact, by this measure at least, the collapse in GDP per capita in 2020 was greater than during any year of the World Wars or the Great Depression. It just shows you the strain on the global system that has just happened in the last 2 decades. And this instability was particularly challenging and surprising for policymakers because it came after several decades of relative stability in what has been so-called the Great Moderation in the 2000s. So many policymakers were taken by surprise. They had to innovate on the fly. They had to respond given the hit to people's incomes and livelihoods. And that is why they were willing to try many untested strategies and reach into new territory and take on new powers that no one had thought central banks would be in before. So the relative calm today, I think, is an opportune time to draw lessons from these battles and think about what we've learned and what we can do better going forward. So that is my goal. That is what we'll do for the next 45 minutes or so. But before I get going and go through my 6 principles, let me just take 2 brief detours. First, I want to say thank you to a number of co-authors and colleagues I have worked with over the last few years. They've been incredibly helpful in discussions that have led me to some of the thinking I will talk about today, and also incredibly helpful in producing some of the research and analysis that I will draw on today as I get into the meat of my comments. Second, just to pause a minute, since this lecture is in honor of Karl Brunner, what would he think of this talk? So let me start with the positives. I unfortunately never had the chance to meet him, but let me speculate on what he would say if he was here. So starting with the positives, I think it's safe to say he would be delighted to engage in this discussion of monetary policy and the optimal strategies for central banks. As a founding member of the Shadow Open Market Committee, which gives advice to the Fed, he enjoys giving advice to central banks and telling them what they should be doing. Also, I think Karl Brunner would be delighted to see the importance I will place on making decisions under uncertainty. This was a key theme of his research, and it's going to be a key theme of my comments. We live in a very uncertain world, subject to global shocks completely outside the control of anyone in this room, and we have to develop strategies to live in this very volatile and uncertain world. So I think those themes Karl Brunner would have agreed with. But to be fair, I think there are also parts of my discussion Karl Brunner would probably be less enthusiastic about. He believed in simple rules for monetary policy rather than discretion. I don't think he could have imagined the expansion of central bank tools and powers that we have seen over the next 2 decades and that I will talk about. But I also doubt, to be fair, that he would have imagined the collapse in GDP that we saw in 2008 and 2020, in which is what forced central banks to innovate and take on these new powers in these new tools. So I hope, even if Karl Brunner doesn't agree with some of the actions taken in the new strategies, that he would have at least supported a careful analysis of these responses and discussion of what we could do better next time around. So with that, let me move forward to this inquiry. What have central banks learned from the past 2 decades? What did they do well? And what could they do better next time? So let's start with principle number 1, at the very beginning of his manual, the importance of laying plans and preparing for the next financial battle. So this might seem trite. Of course, everyone should plan ahead. Good idea to plan ahead. Who can argue with that? But there is more to that, and the importance of planning ahead for central banks has become more pressing as the world has become more globalized and because of technological innovation. Let's take 2008. There were problems in the US housing market that quickly spread from the US housing market to individual banks in the US, to banks around the world, to then other financial institutions, from insurance to mutual funds, and could have caused the collapse of financial systems. And then, as we saw, as a number of European countries struggled with collapses of their financial systems, threatened the creditworthiness of governments. So shocks, crises can spread very quickly around institutions, around countries, and around the world. And there's often not a lot of time to react. And if that is not troubling enough, our technological innovation has meant we have even less time to respond. So just Sun Tzu's principle, the general who wins a battle makes calculations ere the battle is fought. He who loses a battle makes but few calculations before. Many calculations lead to victory, and few lead to defeat. It is very important now to plan ahead in this globalized world. And again, technological innovations make the importance of planning ahead even more important. We can see that by looking at a couple of the most recent banking collapses. And I'm going to focus just on the US. So let's take 2 of the biggest banking collapses in the US in 2008, WAMU and Wachovia, and then 2 of the most recent banking collapses in the US, SVB and Signature. In 2008, not that long ago, but the runs on these 2 banks took about 16 days for WAMU, 19 days for Wachovia, before the run on the bank meant it had to declare bankruptcy. During those roughly 2 to 3 weeks, the banks lost 4 to 10% of their deposits. Okay, that was a pretty quick bank run, and that was just as recently as 2008. Now let's look at what happened in 2023. It took basically 1 day for SVB to go bankrupt. 2 days if you count the withdrawals that were made electronically on day 1 and couldn't be fulfilled until day 2, at which time it went bankrupt. In that day, basically, day or 2, depending on how you count it, 87% of SVB deposits disappeared. So the speed with which these financial crises hit has accelerated. And again, part of it is technology. It's much faster to take your money out when you just click on your computer on your desk rather than having to go to the bank and wait in line and pull it out. And with social media, rumors, data, facts spread much more quickly, so you can suddenly have large amounts of people and investors making the exact same trade or pulling money out very quickly. So there is just less and less time for central banks to respond. So that is why planning ahead is not just trite, but it is something that is critically important to start to do. So how do you do this? It's easy to say plan ahead. Getting into the details is much more than I will do in the next 45 minutes. But here's just a few broad ideas of what I think should be a priority. Central banks do need to plan ahead for different types of emergency, liquidity, market support facilities ahead of time so they can be activated quickly in a day if needed. Hopefully, we will never use these. Hopefully, a lot of this is planning that will be wasted. That would be the ideal. But knowing how quickly crises spread, you need to be ready to respond quickly. That means thinking about who makes the decision, what the trigger is to be able to use this emergency support facility, what institutions have access, what collateral you need. And I think most important is the last two, which are what often get forgotten when you're in an emergency and have to very quickly try to support a financial institution because you're worried about contagion. You should also charge a penalty fee for access to any sort of emergency liquidity or market support. And you should think about how you can end the support and wind down the facility quickly and efficiently. Often in an emergency, you just do whatever it takes and you don't think about that, and those are important concepts. I know in the SVB collapse in the US, there was such a rush to support regional banks, it ended up basically being a subsidy to the banks instead of charging them for making bad decisions in the past. And I think that's something that if you plan ahead, you can be ready to go. Again, details get very complicated, but a few ideas for starting points. Bank of England, I think, did a very good job handling their crisis in the LDI industry. It's a part of the pension industry. The pension funds were on the verge of collapse. They offered them some liquidity support at a fee, a penalty fee. The pension funds initially didn't want to pay that. They thought they could get free support. And there was a bit of a game, and the Bank of England stood their ground, and they ended up, the facilities ended up, or the institutions ended up paying the fee. Lasted quickly. When markets stabilized, they could quickly withdraw, sell the assets, and they actually made money on it and stabilized things. That's a very good example of the type of facilities we should be thinking about quickly. And Neil Kaship just hit a nice proposal at Jackson Hole Conference on how to create governing bodies to oversee these types of facilities. I won't get in Credit Suisse, that's a long discussion. But lots more details, which I will get into as we go on to other principles. So principle 1, lay plans in advance. Principle number 2, the power of heaven and the inevitability of powerful external shocks. So Sun Tzu, at the beginning of his book, talks about the 5 constant factors that are critical before you start to do any other planning. You must take into account those factors. One of the first is heaven. That signifies night and day, cold and heat, times and seasons, storms, blizzards, floods. These are the external events that every general should be familiar with. If you know them, you will be victorious. If not, you will fail. And by external shocks, again, that can mean a whole variety of things. We've seen in the military world how blizzards were powerful. They largely defeated great generals like, or famous generals like Napoleon. The Russian winter is hard to fight against. Sometimes there are just external factors, weather you can't do anything about. Similar for central bankers. External shocks, what happens in the rest of the world, can have first-order effect on growth, on income, on inflation, on your policy, and there's just not much you can do about it. And these shocks seem to come in waves. Let me just show you a few examples of this. I'm going to now just focus on advanced economies to keep this more concise. But this shows you the share of advanced economies that have had GDP growth that we'll call stagnant or recession. The red is GDP growth less than 1%, and the lighter red less than 0%. There are just periods when a large share of economies are basically not growing and in recession. And in particular, you see the struggles around the 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 pandemic. There's periods, no matter what policies you're following in a country, how much support you're providing, you're going to be hit with slow growth and be in a recession. In inflation, the role of global shocks can be even greater. This shows the share of advanced economies with inflation too hot, just using the criteria of higher than 2.5% in red. Blue is when inflation is too low, let's say below 1.5%. And you see these big swings. There's times, like in the 1970s, and then most recently, 2021 to 2023, where inflation was far too high in most advanced economies, almost all. But then there's also periods when inflation is too low in most advanced economies. This isn't because of sudden changes in policies. A lot of this is global shocks, which drive growth and inflation, and there's only so much you can do as a policymaker. So not surprising, given these synchronized swings in inflation and growth, you also get synchronized swings in policy around the world. For example, this is a graph of what central banks have done Blue is the share of advanced economies tightening monetary policy through raising rates. Red is the share easing policy through lower rates or asset purchases. The lighter colors are when you're at the end of a tightening or easing cycle and you have interest rates on hold. You're just sort of waiting to see what the next move is. And I'd like to focus on those blue peaks. They look a bit like Swiss mountains with glaciers falling off the side when rates are on hold. But this shows there are several periods when basically all central banks in the world are raising interest rates. And then the red, there's some periods when basically everyone is lowering rates. And again, this is because of these big global shocks that cause policymakers to act in what appears to be a synchronized way. So what drives these global shocks? If these are so critically important for your policy decisions, what drives them? So here's a graph of a recent research project I've been working on with two co-authors at the World Bank. We've been trying to understand these global shocks better and break down what is causing them so we can better understand their role. And what we find is that the role of these global shocks, which is in red here, is increasing quite dramatically over time. The role of global shocks in driving interest rates, for example, has more than doubled since the 1970s. If you further break down what is behind these global shocks, this breaks them down again. The blue is domestic shocks, red, different shades of red in the bottom are global shocks. A lot of it is supply shocks in oil. Those are the bright red at the very bottom. Supply shocks, oil shocks, not surprisingly, have played a greater role in determining monetary policy and inflation the last few years than at any time historically, even more so than the oil price shocks of the 1970s. So the oil shocks, the supply shocks around COVID as supply chains froze up, were critically important in driving policy. But also important was the lighter pink, which is demand shocks. As economies around the world opened up after the pandemic, a lot of people had savings they hadn't been able to spend. Everyone wanted to go out and spend, and that also hit a big factor, or was a big factor. So understanding what is driving the global shocks is becoming more and more important as these shocks are bigger and bigger and play a bigger role in the appropriate path for monetary policy. Just a little side note, if you break this down by country, I thought it was interesting where Switzerland stands. So Switzerland's there in the middle. Global shocks have been particularly important for monetary policy. So a lot of what the SNB does is outside their control. It is reacting to these powerful global shocks. Here's another breakdown. This is just for the past few years of just the power of supply shocks and also global demand and just affecting what is the appropriate policy for Switzerland. And it is a particularly big challenge here where the role of global shocks is just particularly large. So what are the lessons? This could be somewhat depressing as a policymaker. There are these huge shocks from heaven outside your control. They are critically important during some periods for growth and inflation and monetary policy, and you can't affect them. So what do you do? So I think one of the first answers is something which actually Switzerland does do quite well, maybe because external shocks are so powerful, but especially where some other countries could learn, is just accept the inevitability of these shocks. You are not going to be able to hit an inflation target to 1 decimal point in any given month when you're subject to these large global shocks. So I see the struggle in the US when inflation before COVID was 1.8, the stress and angst about what you do to bring it up by 0.2 when these external shocks are so powerful. I think more central banks should go to more of an approach like here, where you have sort of a band, you have a range to go for, focusing too on underlying inflation, maybe not headline inflation, so you don't put as much weight when prices bump up and down because of oil shocks, which tend to be temporary. And also something Switzerland does well, not focusing on hitting an inflation target every month. You're just not going to be able to do it because of these external shocks, which are going to bump you off course. Instead, you should set policy to target inflation in 2 years or 3 years' time, as you do here, because that's when monetary policy can work, and that's when the effect of these shocks usually fades. Also, like to see more focus in central banking on explaining global shocks, understanding them, and being more careful about what's driving them. There's been a tendency when you see some sort of global event to assume it's all a supply shock. I think this was true the last couple of years. And that tendency is natural because you look at the newspapers, it's all about, the headlines are about supply stories. Russia invading Ukraine hits oil prices and hits food prices. You know, that is headlines. When you get a ship stuck in the Suez Canal that muddies up transportation supply chains, you know, that's headlines. So we tend to think a lot of these price movements are these headlines, these global supply shocks. But the graphs I just showed you show that often it is changes in demand. It's harder to measure, but the monetary policy response can be quite different. And also, I think we should all do a better job as policymakers and economists preparing companies, households, governments for the fact that we just can't control some of this. We're often going to get these big shocks. We all do forecasts, and then we have these wide error bands and say, oh, those other options are in the wide error bands, but no one pays attention to the wide error bands. I think we should do a better job of just laying out some concrete scenarios. What if this horrific war in the Middle East drags on and gets worse? What will that mean to oil prices? What will that mean to inflation? What will that mean for monetary policy? We don't like to talk about these events. They're uncomfortable, but we probably should be clearer on what would happen so that people can prepare. Even if we hope they won't happen and it's a small probability, being more candid about these risks is probably helpful, albeit uncomfortable. Okay, lesson number 3, Earth terrain and the importance of establishing a strong tactical position. So back to the basic principles, you have to account for the heavenly shocks, and also you must know Earth, and then your victory will be complete. If only were that easy. But by Earth, what Sun Tzu means is the distances, great and small, danger, security, open ground, basically your environment, your surroundings. Once the crisis starts, you have to take those surroundings as given. You can't affect them. But beforehand, you can maneuver and establish a different starting port, establish a fortified position. You do have some ability to determine your Earth and your terrain if you plan ahead. And security against defeat implies defensive tactics. If you're skilled in working with these constraints, the Earth, the terrain around you, you can build stronger defensive positions. So for central banking, we have learned, this is where we have learned a lot since 2008. One of the weaknesses or major flaws in our defenses around the world was a lack of macroprudential oversight. There was not sufficient consideration of how a shock to one bank can quickly spread to other banks and other financial institutions and bring down a whole financial system, literally. To do that, you need an oversight of the broader risks to the financial system, how different pieces are interrelated, how shocks spread. And that's something, again, there just was not very much attention to. And this is where we did learn from the 2008 crisis. Countries around the world have adapted macroprudential authorities and macroprudential frameworks. This graph shows the adoption of macroprudential policies to address some of these broader risks to the financial system. Since 2008, you see actually emerging markets were earlier doing this, partly because they have had to face more volatility and vulnerability around foreign exchange movements and other risks. But after 2008, advanced economies jumped in, and they have really been or made substantial progress building their macroprudential fortifications. And what's also exciting as a researcher, now that we've had a number of countries adopting these policies, building macroprudential frameworks, we can now actually do research and assess what works and what doesn't work. And so far, there's been hundreds of papers. Of course, academics don't always agree, so I can't say they all have the exact same results. But the general lessons we're learning are that is when you adopt these macroprudential policies, worrying about risks to the broader financial system, they are effective at reducing the vulnerabilities you target. So if you're worried, say, about mortgage debt, set up some macroprudential regulations addressing that. Or if you're worried about FX vulnerability, those do work at reducing your exposures. And these do improve the resilience of the banking system. We saw some of that in 2020 when we hit a major shock and banks did okay. Granted, there was support that came pretty quickly, but they held up much better than they had before. So that's the good news. The bad news, what we've also learned about through all this research, is that when you put on regulations on specific institutions or sectors, investors are smart. They then move financial intermediation to other sectors or other intermediaries, and some of the risks are shifting to other players, other institutions, and other entities. And that can then increase the risks and spillovers from those other unregulated sectors. And those unregulated sectors are probably more connected than we fully understand. So learned a lot, made some progress, still more to do. And again, getting into the weeds of macroprudential policy gets quite boring and quite technical, so let me just mention a few high-level suggestions for how to continue to strengthen positions going forward. First, priority should be addressing the gaps in our current oversight. As financial intermediation is shifting, we're seeing more risks in other sectors. We need to target those. Regulators know this. It's been on the agenda, but many have sort of lost steam because there is political pushback. These institutions don't want more regulation. It often is costly, but we need to find the right balance because there are risks shifting. I think the problems in the pension sector, the LDI sector in the UK, was a wake-up call to how these risks can be shifting. And we need to understand how related the banking system is to these other risks. I don't think we fully understand that. We can make greater use of buffers, which get tighter during good times, fall during weak times. They're out there. Some countries, including Switzerland, have them and use them, but not nearly as much as academics would suggest to build your buffers. Again, I think it would be useful to do more creative scenario analysis. I think we now do stress testing, which is good. Central banks come up with some worst-case scenarios and try to model the effects on banks. But I think we've seen we aren't being creative enough. For example, the Bank of England has one of the better macroprudential authorities and frameworks. They do these stress tests, and they completely miss the problems in the LDI pension sector. So I think we all need to push ourselves and be more creative. And finally, strengthen the institutions that do this sort of regulatory and macroprudential oversight. That is particularly relevant for the US, where our oversight of these is spread out, diffuse, and subject to a lot of political pressures, and probably one of the weaker systems in the world, which is worrisome given the size of the US financial system. Okay, lesson number 4. Maneuvering, combining weapons and methods. So as one might guess, in Sun Tzu's book, there is a lot on this. But what I thought was sort of interesting and relevant to central banks. In central banks, there's often a division between conventional policies, raising and lowering rates, and unconventional policies, the whole new set of tools that have been introduced. And there's an analogy to military strategy. In fighting the direct method, you might say raising and lowering interest rates for joining battle, but the indirect methods will be needed to secure victory. In battle, there's not more than 2 methods of attack, but you can combine them in an endless series of maneuvers, and that's what we've seen the past 2 decades. There's lots of analogies about water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows, but the soldier must work out your victory in relation to the foe you're facing. So central banks now have a whole array of new tools, and we have learned a lot about how you combine them, how you use them, when to use one, not the other. So for those of you who have not followed the details of what central banks have done the last few years, I'm going to do a quick summary. So first, central banks, although there has been an explosion of new powers and tools for central banks the last 2 decades, it is not unusual for central banks to innovate and come up with new methods and come up with new tools. One of my favorite examples comes from the Bank of England. This is the courtroom where we would sometimes have meetings. It's just a fantastic room. But what you probably can't see is on the back here, sort of in between the columns, there's something that looks a little like a clock. So here is my not great camera or picture from my iPhone, which shows the close-up of what is on the wall back there. Again, it looks a little like a clock. It actually shows the direction of the wind. And this used to be a central tool for central bankers when setting monetary policy. Anyone want to guess why? It's not a joke. Shipping, yes. So when the wind pointed in a certain direction, ships could go up the Thames, which is the key channel. They'd go up the Thames, and then they could unload in London. And then you'd have a big expansion of trade because of the direction of the wind. So we used to regularly joke, if only monetary policy was that simple today, it'd be wonderful. But that's just an example of some of the creative tools that have been used over the decades. But let's fast forward. The explosion of new tools and innovation the last 2 decades, again, has been tremendous, albeit not quite as exciting as shipping. Arguably. So let me start with what the traditional approach used to be. The traditional approach used to be bad things happen, global financial crisis hits in 2008, central banks lower interest rates. And this shows just pick 8 major advanced economy central banks, shows how when the crisis hit, most of them lowered interest rates, many lowered them to basically 0 or as low as they could go. And that's how you support economies, support income, support growth. But then as interest rates were at 0, many thought they couldn't go lower at the time, central banks started to experiment with new tools. One thing they began to experiment was quantitative easing, when central banks basically go out and buy government bonds or corporate bonds or other assets. And this shows the expansion of central bank balance sheets. First, the Bank of England and the Fed started to buy government bonds and US mortgage-backed securities, and you see there increased more purchases. And then as the euro crisis went on, you saw the ECB and Riksbank also start to buy some assets and expand their balance sheets. So that was sort of an experiment then, but the evidence suggested it did boost incomes, stabilize financial systems, support growth, so new tool. And then at the same time, they also introduced a whole new set of programs to provide liquidity and support market functioning. So that was 2008. And then very quickly, before many economies had time to normalize, the pandemic hit in 2020. So first response, lower interest rates, but look at the problem right here. 2020, most interest rates are already at 0. In Switzerland are at minus 75 basis points. So not much more room to go if you want to lower interest rates to support your economies. So quickly, central banks jumped into what they'd been experimenting with before, buying assets and asset purchases. Again, Switzerland's a little different. It does more FX intervention. But for the other advanced economies, it's about buying domestic assets. And this shows, you see on the far right, just the jump in asset purchases as a number of major central banks, including some that had never done this before, went and bought corporate bonds, government bonds, municipal bonds, territory bonds, a whole array of assets. And again, part of it is because you couldn't lower interest rates any further, and they felt they had to do something. In many cases, too, these programs, these asset purchase programs, they could roll them out quickly because they'd used them before, but then they expanded them, bought more, bought much faster, expanded what you could buy. But they could do it quickly because the plans were already in the books and they'd experimented with it before. And then on top of that, and this just captures the switch in strategy. The blue shows how much central banks lowered interest rates in 2008. The red shows how far they could go into 2020. Not much ammunition left. So instead, they switched to asset purchases. Again, blue was purchases in 2008, red in 2020, and they just shifted their a lot of their focus of supporting economies. And then on top of that, they did this other whole set of programs. I will not go into all the details, but this just lists a range of countries, and you see how countries around the world didn't just lower interest rates. That's the first row. If I was teaching a class 20 years ago, that would have been all I would have had to show you, just that first row. That was pretty much what central banks did. Everything else since then is this whole new set of tools that has been added to the toolkit that were used quite widely. So this is this expansion of tools and powers we have seen in central banks that is just remarkable over the last 2 decades. And then one more tool, which shifting from crisis to then recoveries, as economies picked up, recovered from 2020, and inflation picked up much faster than expected, we also saw a shift in how central banks are thinking about tools on the other direction. So the traditional playbook has been, if you're doing QE, buying assets, first you've got to stop that. Then you can raise interest rates. The first interest rate hike is the liftoff. Then you could start shrinking your balance sheet, getting rid of all those things you had to buy during the crisis. Do it first by letting some run off naturally when they expire. That's passive QT. And then you could actively sell them. So that's the sort of playbook central banks have been aiming for since they started these emergency policies in 2008. But central banks have never gotten far since they unwound them. The only country that actually got to stage 3 and started to shrink its balance sheet and get rid of all these assets it bought after 2008 was the US. And in the US, it took them basically 3 years from when they stopped buying assets, doing QE, till they started to let their balance sheets shrink. And that was the fastest of any economy. And as the US started to try to get rid of these assets it bought and do QT, suddenly they found that it seemed to affect markets more than they expected, and they had to stop earlier than expected. So that was the lesson that central banks faced after the pandemic. They'd bought all these assets, but they didn't know what the effect would be if they started to unwind them and get rid of all these things they bought. There really was only one example of a country that had tried. It had looked like it was effective at first, and then it started to create some market stress. So this is where central banks, I think, should get some credit. Despite the fact they didn't know what the effect would be, after this huge expansion of purchases and authority, they did want to start to rein back. So as economies recovered, inflation picked up, this is how quickly they started to get rid of their assets, let them roll off and shrink their balance sheets and unwind some of these emergency policies. They did it, the average time from when they ended QE and started QT was 3 months instead of 3 years. And right now, this doesn't seem that exciting. It seems to have gone off without a hitch, at least so far. But at the time, this was a big gamble. Central banks did not know what was going to happen, and there was still a lot of uncertainty. But they felt it was important to try to get out of these huge balance sheets. And now, good news is now that a number of countries have actually done it, we've hit a little time, we know roughly what the effect was. And what we found is that the effect of this new tool, QT, is that it does increase government bond yields a bit. This is some recent research I've been doing with Wenchin Zhu and Matt Luzetti, where we track what the effects of countries shrinking their balance sheets are on bonds of different maturities. That's what these different colors are. Different effects in different countries. UK is some of the biggest effects, as they've been some of the most aggressive, talking about shrinking their balance sheet, actively selling bonds. So your range of effects. So QT is a new tool now. It can tighten monetary policy, raise rates. So where does this fit in the toolkit? So this is sort of exciting new ground. Is this another tool central banks could use if they want to fight inflation? So this is what we've also learned. Yes, it works as expected. QT does sort of raise bond yields. That should act to tighten financial conditions, but the effect is tiny. I have blown up that scale. Let me now put that scale on the same one we use when we look at what you do with interest rates. This is what central banks have done for interest rates since inflation took off. On average, central banks have raised interest rates about 500 basis points. What that equivalent is in terms of the impact of QT, now I'm going to put it on the same scale, is roughly there. So QT, great new tool. I think it's fantastic. Central banks are willing to move forward, shrink balance sheets without really knowing the effects. Has tightened financial conditions, but if you want to fight inflation, it's probably not going to get you that far. You do need to shift to the old tool of interest rates. So that was a quick overview of we have learned a lot in terms of using tools, combining tools, how they work. Some lessons, just go over a few quickly. Conventional tools, raising and lowering rates, is still probably the best place to start. It's the best way to provide stimulus. It's the best way to tighten conditions if you want to fight inflation, except maybe in periods of severe market illiquidity and stress. But at times you might not be able to lower rates further, then you can go to QE. But I think we've also learned for QT, if you buy a lot of these assets and want to shrink your balance sheet, you shouldn't wait until you're done with everything else. You can reduce your balance sheet, get rid of some of the stuff you bought in the background while you go about raising rates or lowering rates. And I think that's a very important lesson we've learned, something central banks were scared to do last time around, now we can do going forward. Also, I think, I probably won't talk about this much, but I think now we have this whole new toolkit. There may be some creative ways we can use different tools based on where the weakness is in the economy. We know that adjusting rates affects the short end of the curve, QE affects the long end, how you do QT affects different segments of the curve, works through different channels. There could be some creative ways to do this in the future. Okay, let me jump forward. Lesson number 5 is the importance, closely related, the importance to be flexible and be able to vary your tactics. He who can modify his tactics in relation to his opponent and thereby succeed in winning may be called a heaven-born captain. You know, who doesn't want to be a heaven-born captain? So you can't repeat tactics which worked in once. You need to adjust your methods for the variety of circumstances. The student of war who is unversed in varying your plans will fail to make the best use of your men, your tools. So what's that mean? So I just went through how central banks have been very flexible, varied their tactics in response to the 2008 crisis and 2020 pandemic. This whole new set of tools that, again, as a teacher, it's a lot harder to teach monetary policy now. We can't just stop at the first row. There's a lot of creativity, innovation that's happened. So I think central banks have actually been quite successful in terms of varying their tactics when crises hit. Where they have been less successful is the other way around when recovery hits and inflation picks up. central banks have been slower to respond, especially the last couple of years. Here's just a couple examples. This shows inflation at the time of the first rate hike, just in the last couple of years in some central banks around the world. See, every central bank there had inflation above their, let's say 2% roughly target, above there before their first rate hike. So central banks were keeping rates very, very low, and in many cases doing QE while inflation was taking off. And this is particularly problematic because when you do monetary policy, there's a lag of 1 to 2 years before it actually starts to affect things. So you should be raising rates before inflation bounces above your target, not after. Switzerland's the only one where at least core inflation wasn't above 2% when they started raising. And since central banks are slow to raise rates, inflation picked up much higher than people expected and people were comfortable with. It just shows the peak of inflation rates in a number of advanced economies, well above what your targets are. And it wasn't just shocks from oil and food prices that are more temporary. Inflation became more ingrained. And you can look at this a number of different ways. The bottom line is central banks were slow to respond when economies recovered. In another project, we look at a bunch of different figures like this. Look at employment growth, unemployment, GDP. What this does is this graphs the typical performance of variables around rate cycles. 0 is when you normally start raising rates. The red is the last cycle. You saw employment growth so much stronger than historically happens before they started raising rates. And you can do this again for a number of variables. So central banks were slow. Why? That's a long discussion. I think there were a lot of reasons why central banks were slow. Some were just confidence that inflation would remain anchored around targets and wouldn't pick up because it had been anchored for so long. They were credible. There was also a sense that after 2008, it took a long time for inflation to come back and recoveries to come back. They didn't, if it was going to be a long recovery again, they didn't want to undermine that. Also belief the Phillips curve was flat, that even if you did a tight economy, inflation just wouldn't pick up much. But I think also part of it, back to central bank tools, was that some of the policies central banks used did constrain their ability to then pivot. Many central banks had promised they would keep rates for low. They had these unlimited QE programs that were hard to then stop doing and unwind. The US was in this very awkward situation where they said, first we will talk about talking about tapering, and then we'll talk about tapering, and then we'll taper, which means slowing down their asset purchases. And then they'll slow down their purchases, and then they'll stop their purchases, and then they'll finally raise rates. That's a long process when suddenly inflation picks up. So I think central banks have learned some important lessons about when you adopt these policies, you've got to adopt them so you can pivot and adjust quickly if the world changes, because the world will often change quickly and in unexpected ways. So lessons, I think when we use these new set of tools, we do need to think more about how you can end them. That means when you do asset purchase programs, some countries just said, we're buying indefinitely, no end date, no limit. Instead, you should have an automatic end date, an automatic limit. If you need to do more, you can renew them, but it's much easier than people build in the expectation they end. Then you don't have to get caught up on this talking about ending the program. You can just end it. I think there's important symmetries we've learned. You can do QT, unwind your balance sheet without a lot of talk and discussion in the background. QE you have to be more careful about. It's more of a constraint. Also, I think what no one really put a lot of thought onto is what you buy when you do these programs. So there was a sense you just buy a lot of assets and that supports the economy, lowers borrowing costs. But if you buy certain types of bonds, they can roll off, and it's easier to end these programs. Other types of bonds don't roll off. Like in the US, we're realizing that some of the mortgage-backed securities central banks bought aren't being refinanced. They're going to be on the balance sheet for a long, long time. So more careful thought about what you buy is important. Also, there's been a tendency in some central banks, I don't know about Switzerland as much, but in some other countries I know better, to sort of tell in advance basically what you're going to do at the next meeting. And then if the data changes, it can be awkward to change what you're going to do if you've given guidance that that's what you plan to do. And sometimes there's actually a bit of a lag between when people get locked up and data comes out and then your decision's announced. So I would like to see us going back to a world where every meeting's live. We don't have to tell everyone in advance what you do at the meeting. And again, I mentioned greater use of scenario analysis so people know that there could be surprises and big changes in policy that aren't your central case. Last lesson I will do quickly, important to think about the costs of battles and trade-offs. If the campaign is protracted, particularly if, say, asset purchase programs are protracted, the resources of the state will not equal the strain. The proximity of an army causes prices to go up. Higher prices cause the people's substance to be drained away. I love that even 2,500 years ago, he's talking about inflation and the risks of inflation if you don't plan well. In the peasantry, the people will be afflicted by heavy exactions. So lots of issues around costs and benefits of all these new policies that have been tried. I will just focus on one particular cost, which I think did not receive sufficient attention, which is the cost of asset purchases, QE programs. Again, Switzerland was a little bit different in its asset purchases, were more in foreign currency bonds and for FX intervention, but this idea of expanding central bank balance sheets. This is the Bank of England's cost, or the net profits in blue, losses in orange red to the Bank of England from its balance sheet. Initially, when central banks did QE in response to 2008, they just made money on them. That's in the very low interest rate environment where rates didn't go up much. It was profitable. So this gave central banks the sense that this was sort of a free lunch. So when the 2020 pandemic hit, you had to go big. You might as well go really big on QE because it was seen as there was no cost. And I think it's part of why some central banks did these huge programs, bought tons of assets, without actually quantifying why they're buying so much, what are the limits. They thought it was cheap or even would make money. But then when interest rates went up, they've started to lose money on the carry and on sales, and that is leading to some pretty big costs. And in the case of the UK, it's passed directly on to the government. And that, as you can imagine, will lead to some political issues. Here's just some numbers from some other countries. Federal Reserve made a lot of money on their balance sheet initially. You can see why they did QE infinity, as I call it, when the pandemic hit. But now they're taking some losses, at least for a few years. Swiss National Bank, again, a little bit different situation, but since we're here, much more volatility in the gains and losses because it's more related to the currency movements, which can be quite volatile year to year. But note here, while there's more volatility in the Swiss National Bank, look at the scales here. This is the losses or gains as a percent of GDP. 15% of GDP is the peak relative to other countries where they're going to have longer term losses, but generally a smaller scope in any given year. So these are costs I think we didn't fully understand when many of these tools were used before. Again, I don't know about Switzerland, but at least in the other economies where I've spent more time, these tools can be costly. Doesn't mean they shouldn't be used, but you should think about the costs when you use them and think about the trade-offs. So just the final point, I think central banks that do use these types of new tools should think carefully about the costs and benefits. Think about the magnitudes. Don't do these programs unlimited if there could be costs. Calibrate what you do, not a free lunch. Think about the cost of unwinding them. And again, what you buy can be very important in these costs, which there wasn't much thought about before because we didn't appreciate the costs. And I think there are also a longer discussion, but should be some careful thought about the institutional framework. For sometimes these tools may need to be used again. There is a cost. How do you insulate a central bank from these costs so they can do what they need to do to reach their mandates without running into political issues if there are costs that come later on? Okay, so let me conclude. So I have covered a lot of ground. I will not summarize all of the lessons, because we covered so much. But I do just want to make a final comment on a tension that some of you may have noticed, especially those of you who are policymakers. There is a bit of tension where there are these large global shocks which affect growth, affect inflation, drive interest rates during certain periods. And then we spend all this time saying what you should do to prepare, to build a stronger position to start with using these methods. But how much can they really do in the face of this world with huge global shocks? So that there is a tension there. But this is how I think about this tension and why I am a bit less worried. I'm going to show you one more set of just colorful graphs. So what this graph shows is the correlations in equity markets around the world. So it lists a bunch of countries on the bottom, the same list of countries on the vertical axis. Don't worry, you're not supposed to read it. The whole point is you're just supposed to look at the colors and get the big picture. But what each square shows is the correlation of each market at the bottom with each market listed at the side. So it's how tightly two equity markets of those two move together. And then it's color-coded. So red means the markets move together very tightly in yellow or in orange. Green, yellow means they don't move together very much. So you see the 45-degree line is dark red. That's because that's the correlation of each market with itself. That's 100, so of course it's bright red. What you see here is it's a pretty cool heat map. Most of those cells are sort of yellow, means markets sort of do their own things in the 1980s, early 1990s. A few of the red squares are things like the market of the US and Canada. Those move together more tightly, no surprise. Okay, so again, don't focus on individual countries, just the patterns. Key lesson is 1980s, 1990s, financial markets were largely independent, largely did their own thing. Fast forward to the era of globalization, markets start moving together more. It's a great era of increased trade, capital flows. Financial markets, again, start moving together much more, especially in the euro area and advanced economies. Global financial crisis, markets move together even more tightly. Markets collapse, they bounce back together. But then we get to a more normal, stable period, and you still have pretty hot heat map. Markets around the world are still pretty tightly linked. Only exceptions are really the outer edge is Venezuela, whose market sort of does its own thing. But other than that, markets are pretty tightly correlated. So if you're worried about financial markets, they do largely move up and down together. And I could do the same graph for other measures of markets, interest rates, different measures of bond yields, et cetera. Fast forward, pandemic, once again, markets become more correlated, typical during crises. And then here's sort of where we are today, similar to the 2010s. Markets pretty highly correlated. So this is where you might start to get depressed as a policymaker. Again, markets pretty correlated around the world, not too much you can do. Now let's do the same thing for GDP growth. Last set of graphs. GDP growth, I'm going to use the same windows, 1980s to 1995s, a lot of white, which means there's not data. I'm going to look at correlations in quarterly real GDP growth. But for the countries there is data, you see pretty low correlations. GDP growth rates were sort of around the world, didn't move together very closely. Fast forward to the era of more integration, globalization, GDP growth still not that correlated. So independent policies and choices do matter. Growth rates don't move together as tightly. Then, global financial crisis, growth rates around the world, again, highly correlated. Output collapses, comes back around the world. And then the great pandemic. I've never seen a heat map like this. Some of this just captures the extreme collapse in output, and then the very rapid recovery. When you get this sort of extreme volatility, it does increase correlations just mechanically. But you might take from this negative outlook for policymakers in that you just can't do too much. Equity markets are highly correlated. During crises, your growth is just determined by these shocks from heaven. There's only so much you can do. But here's where I'm more optimistic. So here again is what we showed you for equities. So during more normal times, outside of crisis times, equity markets are pretty correlated. But this is the comparable graph for growth rates. Not very correlated at all. And this is where I take some faith in why it is important to think about good policies and the right policy responses. Policy responses taken by individual countries are what determines your growth rate during normal, stable times. During crises, there's only so much you can do, but then when things normalize, your policy choices matter. And I would argue that, well, financial markets obviously matter, that affects income, but it is GDP growth which is the more important measure of well-being in a country. And that is the measure that policymakers can affect. So let me just conclude, hopefully my comments, in the advice of Sun Tzu, who provided some useful principles and counsel, so central banks will be able to continue to innovate and support their economies and feel some power that they can affect what matters most to people, which is income levels around the world. And hopefully some of these tips will provide some good advice for moving forward in the future. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Nice to meet you. Oh, I think here. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Kristin, for painting us a picture about the art of monetary policy. So we're moving into a Q&A now, and you have a bit of time to think about your questions while I go ahead with mine. Now, today's global economy is increasingly fragmented. We are seeing the emergence of different economic blocks. each with its own protectionist policies. So these dynamics seem to diverge from the more integrated global economy of previous decades. Given this shift, how do you foresee these economic blocks influencing inflationary trends for the next few decades?
So let me make 2 points. First, I think we are seeing some very large shifts in trade patterns, capital flows, because of this fragmentation and because of geopolitical concerns. But I think we also shouldn't take from that globalization is ending, we're splitting into groups. If you actually track some of these trade flows, the IMF has done some very good job, for example. Trade between China and the US has fallen, but US is buying more from Vietnam and other countries in Asia. So it's not that we are fragmenting and splitting into separate blocks. It's like we're adding some hubs on those supply chains as they come through. So we are still very interconnected, just interconnected in a different way. But adding these extra hubs on the supply chains is costly. It means it's going to just cost more. Trade will not be as efficient, especially countries that have tariffs and barriers. Again, costs are going up. So that does mean there's going to be a shock to, inflation will be at least temporarily higher when you put on, say, tariffs and you initially have to adjust to these longer supply chains and more costly routes. Over time, it will probably mean less dynamic and less efficient economies, and we won't be able to grow quite as quickly. And that is going to be a longer-term pressure on economies and growth. And I worry more about the impact on growth and income levels than even inflation. Central banks can adjust policy if based on what happens to the price level, but it's just going to mean less innovation, less productive economies, and slower growth and lower income levels.
Thank you very much.
I tried to end positive.
Yeah. And with that, I'll turn to the audience, and we start with the central banker, Martin Schlegel, yes?
Thank you. I still have the microphone.
Yeah,
it works.
It works.
So thank you very much for this very fascinating presentation. It was very, very interesting. So we really agree on what to target, like to have a target range instead of an exact point target. When it comes to which inflation to target, you recommend to use the core inflation instead of headline inflation. Mm-hmm. How do you think this would work out in reality, like in terms of communication? Because probably you have a low core inflation. The central bank can say all fine, but still headline inflation could be quite high. And usually in the media, it's the headline inflation and not the core inflation.
That is an excellent question, and I'll admit I've struggled with that too, is what people care about is headline inflation, because that includes the cost of gas, the cost of food. Those are the big tangible costs people care about. So that is what you want central bankers to think about and care about. But in countries that have a point target for inflation and they're held against it every given month, so much of the volatility every month is the oil and gas and commodity prices. So it just means you just can't hit it. I think that the compromise, though, is, as you do in Switzerland, is if you can have people understand that your target isn't inflation that month, but it's where it is in 2 to 3 years, then you probably could focus on headline inflation, because then some of these temporary shocks should fade and you're targeting headline inflation. So that's another way. If you're comfortable focusing, again, out 2 to 3 years, then the difference probably shouldn't make much difference. So probably not as much of an issue for Switzerland as the countries that want much shorter-term inflation targets you have to meet every month.
Thank you. Any further questions from the audience here? You actually have a microphone, and you can just press the button, and it turns right.
Thank you. Tobias Straumann, University of Zurich. I would like to ask something about the liquidity bank run. How can we stop that? You showed that it's much faster nowadays, although these two Silicon Valley banks are maybe a bit special. But nevertheless, I think we agree that it's much faster now. And in earlier times, the authorities imposed the banking holiday. It was really brutal. Just stop, finished, bank was closed. Can we learn from that for today's digital world? That, for example, we have like a threshold when a bank loses 10% of its deposits, that automatically kind of there is a stop, or is this too dangerous in terms of contagion, or is it really from another banking system we cannot apply to today?
Yeah, that's okay. So there could be strategies where you limit the amount of withdrawal per day, and that might at least slow the run. two issues, though, is one, for example, for SVB, some of the withdrawals were not individuals who might only need X amount of money per day, where then a limit matters. Many of the withdrawals were small companies that needed a lot of money really quickly to meet payroll. So then it gets really tricky. You know, where do you set the threshold? You set a higher threshold for your startup internet company and a low threshold for the grandfather who needs money. Yeah, I'm not sure I'd want to get into that. But then the other issue, if you are just trying to slow down the withdrawals by limiting how much happens per day, the only way that would work is if then you think there will be some real news or some information that will make people not worry about withdrawing, so that buying time will actually prevent the run. Nowadays, the way sort of rumors spread the internet, that would have to be a pretty powerful action to make people think that it's not worth going click, click, and putting your money in another bank a day or two later. So I think that I could see it might be worth thinking about. And as I said, it's important to develop plans. Maybe that is part of one of these plans where the run happens midweek and you just need a couple more days. Maybe there's a way to think about that and implement it to buy you those couple more days to really thresh out your policy. But this is a great example of why you'd want to really think about it carefully if you're going to set limits, how it affects different people and individuals versus businesses. So I'd say that should be one of these sort of parts of these packages you think about. Not just implement off the cuff.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, you with the glasses. Yeah, go ahead.
Martin Wheel from King's College in London. Looking at the heat maps, I found myself wondering which one is the Forbes tartan. But let me ask a more practical question. I don't think you said anything about central bank digital currency. Do you see any role for them going ahead, or are they just a gimmick that is in here?
Martin, I have missed your comments. So for all of you who don't, Martin Wheel was on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England with me. I was sure you were going to disagree with something I said about the UK. Instead, the much easier question, right, of digital currency. So digital currency, I can see why some countries might want to try that. But I don't fully see the need or justification or reason for it. Right now, with electronic transactions being much faster, doing a digital currency for a central bank, it means a central bank will have to take on a lot of risk. They'd better make sure the technology behind that is working well, and there's not mistakes or errors that then central banks would be liable with. There's just a whole set of complicated issues where we have already seen such an expansion of central bank powers. I would be hesitant to have them then go into this world without much more careful thought in how they would address some of these security issues, privacy issues, what if there is some technological glitch, how they handle that. That's another whole host of big issues. And I'm at my core, I'm a believer in trying to keep central bank mandates more limited if possible. They have a really big task, and it often makes you unpopular already. To put a lot of other issues on their plate is just going to make it harder for them to accomplish some really important tasks like price stability. So this is another area I would be hesitant to veer into unless I had very strong arguments why, and I haven't been convinced yet.
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, go ahead.
So my name is Karl, former employee from Credit Suisse. So you talked about crisis in the past. And it's widely known that crises are closely related with the behavior of the commercial banks. And it was the Bank of England who started in 2014 to admit that how money comes into the world and the money creation is in fact a process of when loans are being made by commercial banks. So before each loan, this money has not existed. And the majority of money currently in circulation is produced in this way by commercial banks. So this money did not exist before that. So could be that the future bazooka that will give us the opportunity to win the next battle if all money is created by a central bank, not by mostly private commercial banks.
So go back to, basically just go back to where the money is run by the central banks. So you don't have this whole network of commercial banks, expensive credit. I would say it's actually even more complicated. It's not just now commercial banks creating credit. We now have a whole set of other financial institutions that create credit and affect the money supply. So it's even more complicated than if you wanted to go back to that simpler world. I think banks are an important intermediary. Banks are also important, especially for some local neighborhoods. If you want a loan for a small startup business, I was on the board of one of my kids' schools. They wanted a loan to do some school improvements. Those you get from your local bank because you know the people, you sit down with the people actually face to face, not on an internet or not by clicking a button. So I think there is an important need for local commercial banks. They know a better idea of the customer, they know a better idea of the risks of loans, and to put all of that in a central bank in a capital city far away from the people who often need access to these smaller loans would be a big change that I don't think central banks could fill that hole. And I think especially, even more so in Europe than in, say, the US, small businesses, you get your startup loan from the local bank. So cutting off that access to credit and channel to credit, I think could have longer negative repercussions that would worry me.
Thank you. Yeah, you in the middle, yeah, go ahead, and then you. No, the guy, and then you. Go ahead, and then we have the
lady. Hello. Thank you very much for the great talk. I'm a PhD student here. I guess this is more of a general question. You were talking about how you were calling for these financial institutions to maybe be a little bit more creative. Do you have any concrete advice as to what guiding principles these organizations can follow to be more creative in, I guess, in this case, you kind of have to be forecasting the future. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, it's a fun one, and actually I think Martin, who just made one of the last questions, could comment on this, is I think the structure of the Bank of England is a nice model for others to think about, where they bring in external experts on each of their committees. They have a monetary policy committee that does monetary policy, financial policy committee that does more of the regulatory, financial, macroprudential oversight, and on each of those committees, they have a large number of external experts from very different backgrounds. They pulled me, more academic, maybe not quite as different, but I know one of my colleagues who I learned a ton from was a leading person in industry and knew a lot about companies. And he often came in with some really different views and angles and things to worry about that were not on my radar as an academic. And you could even expand that and just bring in some people with very different backgrounds to say, here's what I'm worried about, here's what I hear from my very different world of contacts, and then feed that through into some of the scenario analysis that's being done. So I think that's a very straightforward way to do it. Sometimes you may not like what comes out of it. It gives you a lot more to worry about. It can also be very, very hard to model some of these risks. But maybe you get someone who's an expert on health. Now that we know the impact of a pandemic, probably you should have someone now who's an expert on geopolitics and on military risks, who can think about how some of the conflicts around the world could explode, and then what the implications are for economics. So I think that's the type of way to bring that in. And there's also a woman over there.
Oh, yeah. First this lady here, and then we'll get to you. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, Maria Vassalou from Pictet Research Institute. I was wondering if you could comment on the idea of potential coordination between fiscal and monetary policy, because obviously central banks are tasked with targeting inflation in the case of the Fed, also of full employment, but a lot of the actions of fiscal policies could have a direct effect on both. And we've seen that very much during the pandemic. So while, of course, the independence of central banks is important, the task of central banks in this framework becomes much harder. And therefore, a lot of the things that you've showed that can be interpreted as external shocks, whereas at least some components of them may be the result of fiscal policy. Thank you.
Yeah. So as an economist, it's easy to write a model where monetary and fiscal authorities can coordinate and it's best for society as a whole. But in practice, it seems that the institutions generally don't work that well. And we have decades of history where if a central bank is part of the broader government, it's just too hard to raise interest rates, raise regulations. It's too costly short term, and then you don't get reelected. And then the tendency is to keep policy too easy, inflation picks up too much, and it's just too hard to bring inflation back down. I mean, we have decades and decades of that experience. So I think you do need some independence. You need a central bank which has clear mandates, clear targets, and then they need to get on with that to some extent separate from the government. But now, but this is where it is that was a very easy, I could stop there if this was 20 years ago. But because of all this expansion of central bank tools and powers, which you're commenting on, the lines are getting blurry. And now more and more of the actions taken by central banks are related to what government's doing. And I think there are some of these new programs which you do probably need both to sign off on, especially when there is a big fiscal liability that will be the government's. They probably should approve some way to comment on these, or some say, especially for some programs also which might affect certain segments of society. I think it does make sense to get the elected government's approval to move forward, especially with some of these innovative new tools and new roles. So the line is getting blurrier, you're right, but I would still like to keep some of the core precepts separate, such as targeting inflation, the basics of interest rate policy. I think it is important to keep those separate, even if there's coordination now on some of the other areas.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Good evening.
Oh, we have a microphone.
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry. Good evening, Grace Mitterland. My name is Sophia Baer. I have a small blog about finance. And first of all, I would like to appreciate your great, absolutely brilliant model for a woman like me. And I have two questions, if you don't mind. What lessons can be learned from past monetary policy mistakes during economic crisis? And second question, how do central banks measure the effectiveness of their policies in real time? Thank you.
Thank you.
So lessons learned, I think I've gone through a lot of lessons learned. I might sort of skip that and spend more time on sort of what do we think the effects of our policies are in real time. I mean, this is something I spent a lot of time on when I was at the Bank of England, and we would do different policies. We have all sorts of forecasts and models to try to predict what the effect is. We spend a lot of time looking at when you adjust interest rates, what the effects are on consumers and households and savings and businesses, and how that filters through into the economy. But when we do it, we are humble, or at least the people I worked with and myself, we are quite humble, because these are just models that don't always work well. And we've particularly seen that the last few years, where a lot of the forecasts and the models completely broke down. So my approach is use the best models we have, but be humble about what they can tell you. You also need to think creatively about why they might be breaking down, why they might not be working. Think about other risks. And that's also then why you need to, whatever you do, make sure there's flexibility built in. One of my principles, because you're going to get it wrong sometimes. You do your best with the information you have, but then either you may get it wrong, or you might get it right for the way the world looked, and then the world completely changes because of these external shocks, so you're going to have to pivot again. So that's where I would like to see more attention paid to, if you adopt a policy, how can you reverse it or get out of it and pivot quickly? No, since you don't often know what the exact effects will be or how the world will look in a year.
Thank you. Then, gentleman here.
Jorge Rodriguez, a fellow countryman of Roberto Rigobon. And we want to bring you back to 20 years ago in Venezuela. My question has to do with rule of law and the speed of reaction of the economy and the policies implemented by the central banks. I could see quickly on your slides perhaps a relationship, just brief relation, on the type of rule of law in the countries. And I just thought of the US system, which is so slow, and I think, 50 years for any lawsuit to be solved compared to Switzerland, where we could settle anything in 2, 3, 4 years. That's the question. What is from your
So
experience?
thank you for not asking about Venezuela on the graphs, which always looks different and has a different color.
We are open for consultations. We are isolated and We know how to avoid those jobs.
So rule of law. So actually, when I did my initial outline for my talk today, if I was initially going to do 8 principles, not 6, and one of them was more about governance and rule of law and institutions. And that is actually in Sun Tzu's book, a big focus of many chapters, which is the importance of strong institutions, of having your leader being supported by the public. That's incredibly important, but I think I went on long enough, so I did, and that was such a big topic, I felt like I couldn't do it justice in 5 minutes. But I think you are right. Institutions, rule of law, incredibly important. It determines the effectiveness, what the impact of these different policies are, she just announced. Also, particularly for central banks, it's important. Having credibility, having an institution that people trust that they will bring inflation back to where you're targeting is incredibly important and makes your job easier. The minute you let it slip, Venezuela, and you do not have a credible central bank that people trust will bring inflation back, then you get a price shock, oil prices go up temporarily, and then it quickly gets priced into people raise prices, they demand higher wages, you get trapped in a wage price spiral, and it's very hard to get out of. So credibility institutions are extremely important in the world of central banking and just more broadly.
Thank you very much. Let's go for 2 questions more. Yes?
Okay. Martin Wipp, retired Swiss banker. In front of the US presidential election, do you think that the Fed can maintain his independency, especially in matter of monetary policy, or would you be the victim of the dictator of one day?
I was hoping I could not talk about the US election for one event. So I will, I don't know what's going to happen, but I will say I have been very impressed with Chair Powell's restraint over the last long number of years, where he has been attacked from all sides, and some people more than others, and he has really kept it professional. He has not been provoked. He has really doubled down on highlighting the importance of data, and it's the economy, and that's why we do what we do, and that's why we make these decisions, and really stepping back from the fray. And I am sure that has been very hard for him at times, but he's done a very good job at it so far. And I've also been impressed more broadly in the US of how most of the country does seem to understand the importance of central bank independence. There were, for example, in some past administrations, some people who've been put up for the governor roles who were more political than qualified, and our Senate turned them down and didn't approve them, despite some very strong political pressures from within the party to put them forward. So I will still maintain faith in our institutions and hope that persists, whatever happens.
Thank you very much. Any last question? Yeah.
Marco Graziano from the University of Basel. You talked about the proliferation of monetary policy instruments in a positive light, but if we want to keep the mandates of the central bank relatively narrow, is there a point where all these instruments start interfering with each other?
A great question. So I rushed through a little bit of that in the section I did on combining the tools, what we've learned. And here I think we have learned a lot, where actually I think most central banks would like to just go back to raising and lowering interest rates. That would be a much easier world. It's a world much more comfortable in because we also understand the effects much better. There's a lot more uncertainty about when you do asset purchases, some of these other programs, what the effects will be, what the costs will be. Just going back to raising and lowering rates would be a lovely world to go back to. But the catch is, if interest rates are now lower, they've gone up some, but they're probably not going to go super high. So if we're hit with some really big shocks, central banks might not be able to lower them to provide the amount of stimulus that is needed to stabilize economies. So then we might need to go back and try some of these other programs. I think what we've also learned too is, so that's the tools for just stabilizing the economy and meeting your price stability targets. But now we are being hit more and more with these sort of market stress scenarios, mini financial crises, bank runs. And then just lowering interest rates, raising it probably isn't going to be that effective. You probably will need to draw on some of these other tools, just given the connection of financial markets and the risks I started to talk about. It's talked about at the beginning. So that's where these other tools, I think we should think about them carefully, design them much more carefully if we need to use them. The hope, again, is never to use them. And hopefully if people know that some of these mechanisms are out there, there won't be the runs that would trigger their use again. You know, I could paint an optimistic scenario, but realistically, we're probably going to be hit by some sort of other crisis and have to pull some of them out. And again, hopefully, you can just support the economy by raising and lowering rates, and then have some more short-term facilities to deal with these issues around market stress and liquidity. But you know, who knows going forward if we are again in an environment where you just can't lower rates anymore, we might have to go back. But again, I think most central bankers would rather not go there. So it's only if you are put in these extreme situations. We've just had 2 once-in-a-lifetime events in 20 years. So I'd like to hope we're done, but that would be quite optimistic.
Thank you very much. Kristin, Forbes, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure. Thank you very much. Yeah, it was a real pleasure hearing you speak here. Now, this session, this lecture has been recorded, and the video will be shared on the YouTube side of the Swiss National Bank. So if you want, you can share that with your community or watch back. Thank you very much to all of you for being here, for participating, and we hope to see you next time when it's time for the 9th Karl Brunner lecture back here. Have a good evening and see you next time. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.